Sunshine goes into the apples, flowers they love the bees. I find my heartbeat a-skipping when apples fall down from the trees. Well, there's a name that every boy or girl in Dorset who's ever been scrumping for apples used to know. And that name is Lazy Lawrence. Lazy Lawrence, the pixie pony, the fairy horse, the sprightly stallion who gallops around all the West Country orchards, guarding the apple trees and protecting their juicy treasures. Well, they call him Lazy Lawrence, but that doesn't tell you the full story, for he is as wild and as feisty as the west wind that blows through the orchards in autumn when the trees are losing their leaves. And if you were ever out and about in an orchard, up to no good, picking other people's apples, then you better be careful, because Lazy Lawrence, he could give a nasty nip with his teeth or a cracking kick with his hooves, and if you were ever caught in the green glare of his eyes, you'd be transfixed, rooted to the spot, unable to move a muscle except your mouth in order to shout, "Lazy Lawrence, let me go, don't all be winter and summer too." Well, in this story, there was once an old widow called Mrs. Mutton, who owned an old apple orchard in Marshwood Vale. It was a wild and wonderful place, filled with dozens of ancient twisted trees that each year produced an abundance of ripe and rosy fruit. There was apples for eating, apples for keeping, apples for cooking, and apples for turning into cider. Ooh-ah! Well, Mrs. Mutton was someone who followed the old ways. She looked after her orchard with tender care, as her parents had shown her to do. But she didn't forget Lazy Lawrence, the guardian spirit, either. And so every evening she left a bucket of clear spring water and a dish of fresh cream. And sure enough, by morning, both of them were empty. But I'm sorry to say Mrs. Mutton had a nasty neighbour. A mean man, a lean man, a man without a smile. He was as bitter and twisted as soured cider. Rather than enjoying the delights of the Dorset countryside, he spent all his time cuddled up at home in his dark, damp cottage, practising dark magic. Eventually, he became a powerful conjurer, but he only ever used his magical powers to cause mischief and to serve his own selfish desires. He'd long regarded Mrs. Mutton's orchard full of juicy apples with avaricious eyes, and in his malicious mind he intended to steal them from her trees. But he also knew about Lazy Lawrence, the guardian of the orchard, and so he bided his time, and he laid his plans like a spider spinning a web. First of all, he ordered a local willow weaver to make a large wicker basket as big as a farm cart. And next he placed his own magical spells of protection and levitation onto the basket. And then, one cold, clear night in early October, with all the apples ripe and ready to pick in Mrs. Mutton's orchard, he climbed into the basket and sailed across the sky, using a ladle as a paddle. He landed the basket right in the middle of the orchard, and then, using more magical incantations, he began to strip the apples off the trees and down into the basket underneath him. Pretty soon he'd removed all the apples from all of the trees, all except one, a golden ball that clung stubbornly to its branch. But the mean magician was so selfish, so spiteful, that he couldn't bear to leave Mrs. Mutton with even one of her own apples, so he redoubled his magical powers with his fingers outstretched until eventually the apple snapped from the tree. It flew through the air and hit him full square in the eye, causing him to fall backwards out of the basket and hit the ground with a loud squeal of pain. His cry was answered by a horse's whinny. There was Lazy Lawrence with flared nostrils and bared teeth, and before the conjurer could climb back into the basket, he was chased around the trees, soundly nipped and kicked along the way. And eventually he was caught in the green glare of Lazy Lawrence's eyes and was immediately transfixed, rooted to the spot, unable to move a muscle except for his own mouth. Lazy Lawrence, let me go, don't hold me winter and summer too. But Lazy Lawrence didn't let him go. And there he stayed all night like a frozen scarecrow, until eventually the morning sun crept into the orchard and released the spell. And as soon as he was free, the conjurer ran as fast as he could, out of the orchard, out of the village, and right out of Dorset. And some folks say he ended up in Somerset. But when Mrs. Mutton awoke and went out into the orchard later that morning, she found all of her apples picked and packed and neatly stacked in a huge wicker basket. Oh, there was apples for eating and apples for keeping, apples for cooking and apples for turning into cider. Wah! And then looking at the ground, she also saw horses' hoofprints underneath the trees, and she knew, with a smile, that Lazy Lawrence had done his job protecting the orchard. And as far as I know, he still does.